Now once more I must ride with my knights to defend what was and the dream of what could be.
Welcome to the Rest Through Orbis channel, and thank you for joining me today. We're going to be exploring Gilded-Age wonders. When you walk about, whether you're in North America, Europe, or wherever you are in the lands, and you see wondrous and very well ornately decorated mansions, you wonder on the origin of them. And most of the time, it's quite a very simple story. There's someone who had a lot of wealth and a lot of capital at their disposal. They hired an architect, and an amazing structure was built. And we'll start by examining Linden Towers, built 1873, Gothic Italian 8th Second Empire, and it was unfortunately demolished in the 1930s. Now, one of the recurring trends that we'll get is, what exactly is the Gilded Age? Well, the Gilded Age describes a time from 1870 to 1890, primarily in the United States, when there was a lot of real wage growth as a result of industrial expansion and the growth of the railroad. Real wage growth, apparently, as opposed to phony wage growth. And it resulted in many people becoming very wealthy and having disposable income to build wondrous places such as these Linden Towers in California, San Francisco to be precise, or in the San Francisco area, Menlo Park. And this was built by James C. Flood, and he was one of those well-to-do entrepreneurs who managed to make a name for himself and earn a lot of capital in the 19th century. So he hired a Canadian architect, and they built this very incredible structure. And of course, as we know, all you need is an architect, a lack of safety standards, a nice industrialization period, and artisans running all over the country. We're actually told that this wondrous edifice is one of the finest examples of artisan work in all of California. Or rather, at least it was until it was untimely demolished. Now, why was it untimely demolished? Well, we're told that when Mr. Flood had this built, he also had another mansion in San Francisco that was his primary mansion, and this particular tower or mansion or castle or whatever you want to call it was extraneous for his uses. Very lovely fountain out there in front of the house, and I have to say the tower is very unique in and of itself. We have to have a very fine and pointy tower, so we know that we're in a wonderful structure. And considering the grounds itself, you get the idea that you're in California, beyond any shadow of a doubt. And some of these images do have the issues with the sky, but we can simply attribute that to limitations of the photography technology at the time. And yet, in every view of this house, we can see that this is made of either stone or some fine structure. Here's the gate that still endures to this day. So considering the story of Mr. Flood, though, after he made his riches in the silver mines, and we're really not going to spend much time because all the stories of these houses that we have, these castles, these mansions, tend to be the same. Somebody struck it rich in some particular area, they hired an architect, and voila. This is another building that's actually on the same grounds as the Linden Tower, and you can see that the subsidiary buildings were just as well built as the main structure. Look at that, you got a little pediment there and some very finely detailed windows, and why not have a dome with a little cupola on it? And apparently this was just a supporting building on the grounds as part of the garden. Very nice. Amazing what you can do with wealth. Here's a picture of Mr. Flood himself, and you'll see it's not an actual photograph, but that doesn't disprove anything. It is a very well-rendered drawing, and I'm sure if we did a little bit more research, we could actually find a photograph. I'm certainly not doubting the existence of Mr. Flood, especially given his wonderful influence that he had at the time in his silver mine. Here's the James C. Flood Mansion that's in San Francisco, and we're going to have to do an exploration of San Francisco, but apparently this was the primary residence, so unfortunately the Linden Towers was not his primary residence, and when Mr. Flood passed away, later in the 19th century, he left the entire estate to his daughter, and she had no use to it, and just decided to let it go. Here's the interior of the Linden Towers, and once again we can see that it is very well decorated on the inside, again, for an extraneous location, an extraneous house. And I always find it interesting that they say people need to have 3 or 4 houses, and of course that is attributable to what we have with modern day wealth, and of course you want to have houses in many different locations. But you'd like to think if you were going to put this kind of effort and this kind of capital into a location, you'd at least spend some time there. I know, the whole concept of going beyond the basics of necessity is the whole intention behind being wealthy. It's why it's the quote-unquote American dream, at least until you come across the comedian in the film Watchmen, or the original comic. I'm very impressed, though, by a lot of the woodwork that we see, and even the layout, and once again, this is something else that you see, from floors to walls to ceiling, beautiful chandelier. It's very decorated, and you can see why someone could really relax and enjoy themselves in this particular structure. Now just think if this edifice still existed today, and look at this, with the little dome and the light work coming in there. We wonder what use it would have. Would this be a museum? Would this be something that was dedicated to the state? Or would this be a bed and breakfast? Those are usually the uses that we see for any of our old world structures that survive to this day, or in this case a Gilded-Age mansion. But we can see that even the sitting room here is very well decorated and ornately detailed. And once again, quite an amazing story that this was all for a mansion that was considered extraneous. Mr. Flood had everything that he needed to live in San Francisco itself. They did not need these Linden Towers. And unfortunately, it was torn down. And personally, I think that's very unfortunate that such a wonderful and lovely house, castle, mansion, whatever you want to call it, was torn down. Because the images that we have show that this is really a palace. And wouldn't it have been incredible if it could have survived and been used even as a museum? At least we'd have something we could interface with today. And that's one of the things that I enjoy with being boots on the ground with explorations, is that you can actually go into these edifices, you can examine them outside, inside, get an idea for what they feel like, really experience them. And it amazes me how many people want to detract you from experiencing things. Well, there's all these scientific scales out there that will tell you that you don't need to do that. You can just look at it on a screen. Sure. This is the Jerome House, 1877 Second Empire, and it was destroyed in 1935. This is in Detroit. So once again, we return to Detroit, and the reason I highlight this one is this gives you the impression of a house that's actually in a neighborhood. So we'd expect these very wealthy individuals to want to build on lavish, isolated estates that are far away from the city. But yet, here we have an example of a structure that's actually in Detroit, and it seems to be in the midst of many other structures that are very well designed and built. So, oddly enough, it gives us a different impression if we're just looking at the images, because we often think that people with wealth from the Gilded Age wanted to build on their estates in the middle of nowhere. And yet here in this image we can see that there were many wonderful houses all built in a row. And indeed at the end of this exploration we're going to look at a particular community that was all about building houses like these that were all next to each other. It kind of flies in the face of what we'd expect to see though, because if people have this kind of wealth, and certainly you can say it's disposable, why would they build a structure that's next to another structure? You'd think they'd want to be more isolated. Certainly they could afford the land, if that's what it all boiled down to. And here we have the classic image of the house, and it looks to be like a little bit of a drawing, and yet despite the fact that it seems narrow, the design and the detail that goes into it is very impressive regardless. And what's the story behind the tower? This is apparently a Lego model of it, or a model of it. And what I always find interesting about these models is how they never compare with the real thing, whether it's a model of the Union Station in Kansas City, and then they have that in the building, and you can see it doesn't compare to the real building, because it's quite telling that we can't even make a small 1 to 1,000 scale model, yes, I'm being extreme on that doesn't compare with the real structure. What exactly does that tell you? Well, once again, remember it was that magical time at the end of the 19th century, Industrial Revolution, no safety standards, real wage growth as opposed to phony wage growth. There was also apparently some sort of economic policies that caused trouble in the United States during the Gilded Age. You might recall there was this big thing called the Depression, and it was just the Great Depression until the actual Great Depression in the 1870s. Oddly enough, it of course did not stop this real wage growth, the building of these Gilded Age mansions, and the construction of many state capitals, which we've been over before. So, I don't know. And now we go to Mississippi to take a look at the Longwood House, constructed 1864 in octagonal oriental style. Very interesting, octagonal style. And this is in Mississippi, and we're informed in the official account that the labor that was used to construct this impressive edifice that has a courthouse, miniature state capitol look to it, was done by slaves. The interesting thing about this house or mansion or castle or county courthouse or whatever it was originally intended to be is that the first floor is the only thing that was finished. It's considered a folly of the individual who tried to build it. Interestingly enough, though, this is considered Gilded Age, although we'd say that the construction of it actually precedes the Gilded Age. Construction stopped because of the United States Civil War. Here's one of the original designs of it, and we can see that it has a slightly different type of onion dome as opposed to the onion dome that was finished. And once again, we look at issues like this where we have drawings and they show different depictions than what we have with the final building. So again, what was really going on there? It's hard to say. And of course the actual plans that we have that are only single perspective, because in the mighty advancements of the 19th century with the extraordinary human beings that were around at that time, they didn't need multiple perspective plans. You only need a single perspective of plans and you can just make things happen. And remember, no safety standards, and yes, in this particular case, unfortunately, we're told that they use slave labor. Here's an image of the finished dining room, and it doesn't exactly conform to what our expectations would be when we look on the inside of this edifice. So I'm wondering if this was additions that were done later, or what exactly was going on. Did they discover the building and that's what they did the drawing of, and then they modified it, and they were in the process of modifying it? I don't know. It seems to indicate a different story than at least the official account that we're given. Now, of course, I'm not questioning the official account here. I'm just saying that we see some inconsistencies in the images. Now, that doesn't necessarily prove anything, because as we've said many times, these are just images. But then we see other interior shots or images of this particular edifice, and we can see some of the fine detailed brickwork, and it looks like we're looking up in the cupola here. This is definitely something I would like to take a look at with an on-site exploration, so it looks like I need to add Mississippi to the list. But a very, very impressive bricks, and again wondering where all the bricks were actually made and formed, and then as you go higher in the structure you can see more of the woodwork, and yet at the same time you can get the fine detailing that still stands in what's very clearly different material, more of the stone or masonry or whatever they actually used, whether it was bricks or some form of concrete. And we know they had concrete back then, but this is a very rather puzzling edifice to consider because it tells many different stories. A different story on the first floor that's finished and then the subsequent floors that's not. That's what the official account tells us. But I have a very distinct feeling that an on-site exploration would reveal many other interpretations behind this impressive edifice in Mississippi. And then when we look at other images, we can see the fine detailing with the layout of the bricks going into the archway here. And even just considering the amount of effort that would go into that, and then you look at the second archway or doorway in the distance, and you can see that it appears to be some different arrangements of the bricks, and then of course the coloring, as though that was an intentional design. And then even here in this particular image, so is this an unfinished structure, or is this a structure that they were in the process of modifying, and they found that it was too difficult? I'm trying to posit some theories for what we're really seeing, because the Longwood House or mansion definitely portrays a different picture. And again, we also wonder, why does it look so much like a county courthouse, or a miniature state capitol almost? And again, we can see that the finished aspect of it doesn't exactly look like what we'd expect. Now, we're told that there's this foray into octagonal and oriental styles, because, we've got a name for every architectural style. But what exactly is the Longwood Mansion? Hard to say. Well, let's go back to Iowa, the Peirce Mansion, 1893, Romanesque revival, and this is in Sioux City, Iowa. Another story behind somebody who struck it rich, made it big, hired an architect, and decided to build themselves a little castle, and they did it in Iowa. Now, keep in mind, this is the part of Iowa that's not too far from the Floyd Monument, that wondrous obelisk that we've looked at in other explorations. We also have a unique story that we're also informed that this particular house or mansion or castle was made with a locally sourced material called Sioux quartzite. So very fascinating. We don't hear of many structures being constructed out of some locally sourced material that is very unique. Granite, quartzite, whatever other cool stone that they had rapid availability towards. It's also intriguing to see such a castle like this in Sioux City in Iowa, because one of our mysteries with Iowa is the fact that it's a more rural and agrarian state. It's certainly not known for its vast quantities of natural resources, aside from, of course, corn, which, while it is a beneficial crop to have and helps feed the world, it's not exactly wealth, such as Mr. Flood's silver mine. Now, if we had the story of silver mines, gold mines being all over Iowa, perhaps this would make a little bit more sense. But even if we did, we also have the smaller population that we're given in the historical account, and despite that, despite people being spread out, they were still able to achieve a structure like this. Now, is this really this Sioux quartzite material that was used to construct this? Was this some sort of geopolymer, or was this something else? Well, of course, we should just roll over and accept what we're told by the mainstream account, because why would anybody want to deceive us or tell us something that's not true? Looking at the images, though, you can see that this structure has always been around in Sioux City and that it's had a variety of uses, and you can still go tour and interface with it today. So that's the good news part of the story, is that you can actually see what this Sioux quartzite is like in person. I'll admit I haven't been to this structure yet, but it's definitely on the on-site explorations list. because it seems to portray many different pictures, and it seems to have a very unique style. We have some columns in the balcony there, and then, oddly enough, we have some subsidiary towers on the second and third floor. Very clearly a 3-floor structure, and multiple chimneys, and of course that's not strange. They needed to have fireplaces in every room to keep it warm because it gets rather cold in Iowa in the winter. I understand. Taking a closer look, though, we kind of see some of the fine detailing there on this quartzite that reminds us of what we've seen in other structures in Iowa, such as the Anamosa Prison, the State Hospital at Independence, which we're told is made out of Anamosa limestone. Now, we're also told this is not Anamosa limestone, but yet it has a little bit of a similar appearance in how it's actually constructed. But look at the variance that you have, though, with the stones and the pillars, and how well milled and formed those pillars really are, or those columns, I should say. And then you also have the 2 smaller towers that are on either side of the window. So again, very impressive detail. Let's take a look on the inside. And here we can see that the inside portrays a slightly different picture. This is a little bit more of a well-adorned mansion, castle, house. I mean, whatever name we want to go with. Manor. So many different names. You know, one of the intriguing things is that Mark Twain, also known as Samuel Clemens, the author from Hannibal, Missouri originally, or at least that's what he's associated with, one of the famous things he is known for saying is that if voting actually gave you power, why would they let you do it? Very interesting. But, I don't know. Mark Twain also had a lot of different interesting, how shall we say, views and perspectives. And looking at the inside here, we can see the very well decorated banister. And we can see that there seems to be a higher quality wood. And of course we'll be told it's a higher quality wood. And that's why this house is standing up so well today and why they can still give tours. The other thing that always stands out to me, though, and whenever you're in one of these Gilded-Age mansions or old world homes, is you get this feeling of relaxation that comes over you. And that's probably one of the reasons why they're so effective when they're converted into bed and breakfasts or museums for tours, as we see happening here. But once again, it's no attention to detail that's spared, because even in the window there you can see that every aspect was considered, and having the entire interior of this home feel relaxing and welcoming seems to be the main aim. We'd like to think that's an aim for homes. This is the Turnblad Mansion, 1908, castle-esque. Castle-esque revival style. Yes, I'm making a play because it's called Shadow-esque revival style, but we'll call it Castle-esque revival style. And today this serves as the American Swedish Institute, and this is in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And of course it's a very modest castle. Shadow-esque, castle-esque. I mean, the names just really have to crack you up. Now, technically this is after the Gilded Age. This is early 20th century, but we can still wrap this up in the Gilded Age, because the beautiful thing about history is sometimes years have hard and fast beginnings and ends to them, such as the beginning of a conflict, but for a certain architectural style, they tend to be a little bit more fluid, because there's always somebody who wants to do a revival style and then do a revival to a revival style a few years later. Very impressive castle, though, and not what we'd be expecting to see in Minneapolis. And I wonder where exactly they found the contractors who were so skilled in Minnesota in the 19th century who could suddenly throw up a very impressive castle. Or chateau. Anyways, when you look and you see the little entryway, and again you can see that archway with the subsidiary pillars on either side of it, and all the very well formed windows in the turrets, and then there's a little additional turret. I don't know. I mean, nobody ever questions the Gilded Age as being ostentatious. I mean, you might have reference to it that it's intriguing, the consideration of how the wealthy were regarded in the 19th century. A lot of people now refer to the wealthy at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century as a lot of wonderful philanthropists who were willing to share their wealth and the results of their wealth with the entire nation. And this is why we remember them fondly. And we compare and contrast that with the term that we have as oligarchs, because there are people who hoard their wealth for themselves. At least that's what the official definition tells us. Isn't this interesting here with that little front porch area with the windowing around it? This is definitely another on-site exploration that needs to be done, because I'm questioning what exactly the material was that was used to construct this. Yes, we'll be given some usual explanation that it's some form of concrete, and for some reason it's holding up perfectly now, and it's just because they put more time in it. We had more artisans, more craftsmen, no safety standards, so anything could be done in the early 20th century even, all the way up until about World War II. But you can see in other images that gives you the indication that this structure has always been around in Minneapolis. And as I said, this is not something we'd expect to see in Minneapolis, Minnesota, nor in Iowa. And yet, it never ceases to amaze me that we have no shortage of impressive houses, mansions, castles, all over the Midwest of the United States. Here's the individual rags to riches, or wags to riches if you're a fan of the old cartoons. And apparently he was the one who decided to build this, and I wonder if he had it in his mind that when he was going to find his architect and the contractors and go to all the trouble to build this very impressive edifice in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where the winters are really nice and welcoming, very sarcastic there, that he knew it was going to become the American Swedish Institute. Very impressive. Once again, we have a single perspective drawing because that's all you need for plans to conduct building this house. And that just shows you the sheer brilliance of the architects at that time. And that's why I think it's totally acceptable that if you just know who the architect was, there's no reason to ask any more questions. The interior is certainly more lavish on this particular mansion, castle, chateau, and we can see it with some of the figures there that look rather familiar by the banister. Where have we seen that before? I think we can get a better image, though, and see exactly what we're looking at. Ah, yes, of course. The lion with wings, the griffin. And then we've seen that symbol, too, that's above it on the banister in this older image. Now, why is it that this particular symbolism was so popular in the 19th century? Did everybody want to throw griffins on their buildings? Maybe it's a Minnesota thing. You know, we saw it with the Plummer building when we were evaluating Art Deco. Or we can see that they did use different styles for their other banisters. I mean, you just ask yourself the question, why do you need a banister that's well adorned? Well, because people had money and they wanted these places to look very welcoming and they wanted to show off. And that's what this was all about. It was just about showing off. Yes, this is what we have, and we have to keep up with the Joneses in the 19th century style. This is a very impressive image because here you can see all the detail in this Turnblad chateau or castle, whatever you want to call it. And look at the fireplace on 2 floors with columns around it. You can also see the detailing in the ceiling because, well, why not? And yet more impressive fireplaces, and I am really shocked that such a structure like this does exist in Minneapolis, even after all these explorations that I've done, because I was certainly unaware of this particular structure until I started doing some referencing for this particular exploration. And this is definitely something that's gone high up on my list of on-site explorations. Again, looking at this main great room, as they would call it, and the way everything seems to intersect here, you can say that this is really a nexus room for this particular Gilded-Age mansion. Although, once again, the timeline for construction is a little bit after the technical Gilded Age, but that's alright. Somebody was looking to reference it. And here you can see this with that figure there. Kind of reminds me of that figure that Worf always had in his quarters. You can see it, though, in this particular display with how you have the columns, and this almost has a little bit of a religious connotation to it, or at least something we'd expect to see in the great cathedrals that we looked at. Very fascinating structure. And again, no shortage of well-adorned and very well-decorated fireplaces. And again, there's that particular symbol. And as always, I invite comments for what you think this structure represents. What's the intention behind all this symbolism that we see everywhere we look? And why do you have to decorate a fireplace so much? Well, again, because you got to show it off. But it's not just the fireplaces, though, in this particular structure. You can see other great detailing there at the top of what looks to be pillars integrated into the walls, and just all the fine detailing where it seems to stand out, like it's a relief. Again, as though they had all the time in the world and all the resources in the world, and this is no issue. And if we need any final confirmation that this is a true old world structure, naturally it's a wedding venue. And just looking at this image, you can see why it's a wedding venue. And I think it's safe to say that all weddings that occur in this particular structure probably have a much better chance of lasting for a lifetime. But that's just my opinion. I'm not a relationship counselor by any means. This is our construction photo. Yes, they actually say this is a construction photo. So I guess this is what passes for a construction photo. You know, looking through a gate, an iron gate, and then seeing that there's a little bit of a mess on the inside. Yeah, I'm convinced. Maybe you could say that that structure there on the left is actually being built. But what's really going on? The other interesting thing about this particular structure is we seem to have a different variety of rooms on the inside of it. And this is one of the main reasons I want to look on the inside and actually verify that these images really do line up with what the reality is. And if anyone's actually been to this edifice, please let me know in the comments, because I haven't had the pleasure yet. But it's very intriguing. Alright, so we're going to close this out by looking at the town of Elberon, New Jersey, or town, township, whatever it really is. And this is supposedly the playground of millionaires. And we have a special site that we're going to take a look at to really view this and see exactly what's going on. So let's take a look at this Elberon, New Jersey, the Playland of Millionaires. Now, we're officially told this is an unincorporated community, although we know how the definition of town, city is rather ambiguous, and I'm sure that's by design as well. It was sometimes called Hollywood of the East, back when it was a summer seashore resort during the Gilded-Age, so we can see how it's referenced and associated with the Gilded-Age. It's hosted presidents, cabinet officers, actors, industrialists, celebrities, bankers, socialites, and senators, all the wondrous people of our society. These chosen few built fantastic seashore mansions and summered here, making it a playland of millionaires. This distinctive section of Long Branch dates back over 150 years. Fabulous array of architectural and construction work going on at the turn of the century. It was a spot of opportunity. The much heralded NYC architectural firm of McKim, White & White got its real start in Elberon, designing many of the massive seaside houses for the rich and famous. So let's take a look at some of these images that we have of this Elberon. And of course, this isn't a real image, but very fascinating that we can get an idea of how this is all laid out. And once again, I ask that question, if you have that kind of disposable income, why exactly do you want to live in a community? Well, maybe back then, the people who were the elite of society, as they're called, didn't want to be isolated. Edwin Booth Cottage. Isn't this exactly what you'd think of when someone says cottage? You'd have a large tower on the cottage, okay? This is the wealthy. These are actors. These are celebrities. These are senators, presidents. Take a look at this. Ocean Avenue. Now again, we don't have a real image here, but this just gives you an idea of how well adorned this is. Look at this over here. An unincorporated community. And of course, the official explanation for why it's an unincorporated community will be because of tax breaks and so forth. Church of the Presidents. And we've got our little plaque out there. Not a very impressive looking church, but there's other things that we're going to look at that are very impressive when we go further into the story of this impressive community. Another cottage. Yes, you can see. This is definitely what we think of when we think of as a cottage. I seem to recall thinking of cottages as being small, but obviously my impression was completely incorrect. And this isn't a cottage? Oh no, this is an actual house. Okay. And when we take a look at this. Now, is this a real image or is this a drawing in an image? Sometimes it's hard to tell. But very impressive structure as a house, and of course we have a very central cupola. I wonder what that looked like on the inside. And we go down and here's Millionaire's Row. Now look at this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 structures that we can see. Very, very well built out with all the trimmings on them. And I don't know what to make of this image at all. If this is an actual photograph or if this is an altered photograph or what's really going on. I'm not suggesting that this proves anything, but the fact that we have an account of this community, and we do have some images. What do we have here? Louis B. Brown, 1813 to 1900, main developer of the city's Elberon section. Mr. Brown looks like he lived a very stressful life. I mean, look at those eyes. I don't know, he must have been under a lot of demands of all these millionaires who were telling him to pull all this off. You need to have the perfect development for this community. If it's wrong, you're going to be fired. Of course, we're told there were much greater consequences in the 19th century, but, we have many different perceptions of the 19th century, so who's to say what was really going on? Now let's scroll down here. We're going to look at some of the other impressive structures because then they try to fill this up. Oh, look at this. President U.S. Grant's Cottage, 1870. Very modest cottage for Ulysses S. Grant. Of course, we're told that the former president ended his times in hardship because he didn't exactly have the greatest business acumen. And as a result, he was swindled and lost his fortune. He managed to get the fortune back for his family when he wrote his memoirs. And it's good to hear that president was able to recover his fortune, even though it wasn't recovered until after he passed away. So again, we have many modest structures, but as we continue looking, we'll see some more impressive ones, such as this Italian villa, again on Ocean Avenue. Yes, look at this. All the trimmings you would expect to see with the many arches and the entryway. And yes, of course, this is exactly what you'd need. So moving on from this impressive Italian villa, let's see what else we have. Another summer home. Yeah, it's a very modest summer home here. I can understand why this would be considered a summer home. Very intriguing. Oh, look at this. Myron H. Oppenheim home called Castle Wall. Yeah, you can see why they'd call it a castle. Looks like you actually have a castle wall that's on the property. I wonder what's exactly going on there with that. Let's see what other impressive structures we have. House of Many Gables, early 1900s. The Elberon house was massive. Yes, that sentence has a massive talent for understatement. Just impressive. Also called the Towers. House was torn down in 1940. Of course, all these houses were probably torn down because, they were a little excessive. Aladdin's Castle, 1920s. Mary Guggenheim summered here. Looks like Mary Guggenheim had herself quite a lot of real estate to enjoy summer activities. Very beautiful. Aladdin's Castle, 1930s. It was at the foot of Park Avenue. And just look at the detail you have in this. You have a tiered dome almost here, and then you have a more well-adorned dome that looks like it's over a balcony. 1, 2, 3, 4 floors. Did it have a basement too? Be very interesting to see interior shots of this. We might have to explore this. The Diller House, somewhere in Monmouth County. Here it's the Diller House. So it looks like it had many different names to it. Interesting. The same structure with many different names. And of course, this is the most telling image that we have. Now again, is this made out of wood? Is this made out of stone? Is this something else? It's hard to tell just from the image itself. We'll of course be told that perhaps this was a little bit more of a modest one that was only made of wood except for the chimney there, but who knows for sure. So what are your thoughts on this unincorporated community with its very lavish structures? Let me know in the comments. And what did you think of this Gilded Age exploration? Well, thank you for joining me.